There are 8 ages of tears. Every era of human history has assigned a different official job to the same lacrimal gland, and your body right now is running all 8 of them. Most people will tell you crying is a private emotional release. The checkpoint will tell you something different. Crying is one of the very few bodily outputs no other animal produces for emotional reasons. Humans are the only species on Earth that weep from grief. And in every civilization that has ever existed, somebody has decided what your tears are for. The Sumerian temple decided they were ritual lament. The ancient mourners guild decided they were paid labor. The Hebrew prophets decided they were prayer. The medieval mystic decided they were the proof of grace. The Romantic era novelist decided they were the proof of a noble soul. The Victorian widow decided they were a substance worth collecting in a small glass bottle. The 20th century father decided his son was not allowed to produce them at all. The 2026 algorithm decided they were content. By the end of this video, you will know which of the 8 job descriptions is currently telling your body when it is allowed to weep. And you will know what your body has been trying to release that the assigned job will not let through. Before the checkpoint opens the first era of tears, one thing has to be said clearly. The reason this video exists at all is that tears are biologically strange. Humans are the only animals on the planet that produce emotional tears. Other animals have lacrimal glands. Other animals cry from physical irritation. No other animal sheds tears from grief, from awe, from beauty, from rage, from longing, from relief. The checkpoint will say this directly. Emotional weeping is one of the very small handful of human behaviors that has no clear animal precedent. It appears in the historical record fully formed in every civilization with no period of cultural invention. That means the same lacrimal gland, the same small organ behind the upper eyelid, has been inherited, unchanged, by every human who has ever lived. The hardware has not been edited, only the software has. The checkpoint will inspect the software now. 8 major eras have written code on top of that gland. Most of the code is still running. Look for the era whose job description is currently telling your body whether the tear is allowed to arrive, even though the people who wrote the code died centuries ago. Most people never notice this. Era 1, the Sumerian lament. About 4,500 years ago, in the cities of Sumer, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, humans wrote down some of the oldest surviving texts on Earth. A large portion of those texts are laments. The lament for Ur, the lament for Sumer, the lament for the goddess Inanna's descent. These were not personal poems. They were ritual scripts performed in the temple by trained voices with tears expected on cue. The Greek tradition inherited the same shape. The chorus of a Greek tragedy is in part a professional weeping body. The audience came to the theater partly so that the chorus could cry on their behalf. The checkpoint has read these laments. The strangest thing about them to a modern eye is that the tears were addressed. They had a destination. The cargo, a bodily output that was understood by the entire civilization to be a form of prayer, the only form of prayer the body could speak without words. The job assigned. Tears as a ritual address to whatever the civilization considered larger than itself. The cost of this era was almost none. The civilization had built a public, sanctioned, expected container for the same bodily output the modern viewer now produces in a locked bathroom at midnight with the lights off. The first job description for tears on the historical record was the body's voice in the temple. Era 2. The professional mourners. Almost every Mediterranean civilization between roughly 2000 BCE and 1500 CE, Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Roman, Etruscan, later medieval European, had a recognized profession of paid mourning. The Romans called them praphicai. The Hebrew tradition called them mekoninoth. In Egypt, the mourners were trained from childhood, paid by the deceased's estate, and expected to weep, tear their clothing, dust their faces, and lead the procession. The book of Jeremiah, written around 600 BCE, explicitly instructs the people to call for the mourning women, that they may come, and to send for the skillful women, that they may come. The text assumes the trade exists. The checkpoint will tell you what the professional mourner era did to the job description of tears. It made weeping a labor, a skill, a trade, a thing one human could be paid to perform on behalf of another human who, for reasons of dignity, status, or composure, could not weep publicly themselves. The cargo, a bodily output that could now be outsourced. A grief that did not arrive in the host body could be hired in from outside. The job assigned, tears as professional service, tears as paid public performance, tears as a thing the dignified did not do for themselves. The cost of this era was the first crack in the civilization-tears relationship. For the first time, weeping was something a richer person could pay a poorer person to do. The body's voice in the temple was now a wage. The second job description for tears on the historical record was the body's voice for hire. Era 3. The biblical tears. Around the same centuries, the Mediterranean was professionalizing weeping. The Hebrew tradition was doing something almost completely opposite. The Psalms, written over roughly 500 years, between about 1000 BCE and 500 BCE, contain dozens of explicit references to weeping as a form of prayer. My tears have been my food day and night. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. The shortest verse in the Christian New Testament, John chapter 11, verse 35, is 2 words long. Jesus wept. The early church considered those 2 words important enough to set as their own verse. The checkpoint will tell you what the biblical era did, that the Sumerian era had only hinted at. It made tears a theological object. Tears were no longer just the body's address to the divine. The divine was now expected, in some traditions, to keep them in a container. The cargo, a bodily output that the host's God was understood to receive, count, and in some passages literally store. The job assigned. Tears as a spoken word the God was personally listening to. The cost of this era was the highest theological weight ever placed on a single bodily output. The body's tear was now, in the Hebrew and Christian traditions, an article of the conversation between the soul and its source. The third job description for tears on the historical record was the body's signed letter, Era 4, the medieval mystic tears. From roughly the 4th century through the late medieval period, in both the Eastern and Western Christian traditions, a doctrine took shape that has almost no modern equivalent. The doctrine of the donum lacrimarum, the gift of tears. The desert fathers, the early monastics in the Egyptian wilderness, taught that tears in prayer were a sign that the heart had finally softened. St. John Climacus, in the 7th century, wrote that the tears of repentance were a second baptism. Ignatius of Loyola, in the 16th century, kept a journal documenting which prayers produced tears and which did not, and treated the tears as theological data. Marjorie Kemp, an English mystic of the early 15th century, wept so loudly and so often in public churches that neighbors begged her to stop. She believed the tears were proof of grace. Many around her believed the tears were proof of madness. The historical record has never resolved which one of them was correct. The checkpoint will tell you what the medieval mystic era did to the job description of tears. It made them currency. The more tears a mystic could produce in prayer, the closer they were said to be to grace. The cargo, a bodily output that now functioned as evidence, admissible in the spiritual courtroom of the era of one's standing with God. The job assigned tears as proof of holiness, tears as a ledger entry, tears as something a saint produced and a sinner could not. The cost of this era was the first time tears became a status object. Mystics competed for them. Confessors evaluated them. The same bodily output that had once been a temple voice was now a pious resume. The fourth job description for tears on the historical record was the body's certificate of grace, Era 5, the Romantic era. Between roughly 1750 and 1850, in Europe and the Americas, a literary and philosophical movement called Romanticism took the medieval mystics' framing of tears and secularized it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in Julie or The New Heloise in 1761, presented weeping not as religious proof, but as proof of moral sensibility. The man who could weep at beauty, at injustice, at the suffering of strangers, was the man with a noble soul. Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, published in 1774, was the first international literary phenomenon in the modern sense. And one of its central themes was the protagonist's freely flowing tears. Across Europe, young men read the book, wept openly, and reportedly imitated Werther's death by suicide in such numbers that several countries banned the book. By the early 19th century, the public weeping of men at speeches, at funerals, at the theater, at the sight of a wounded soldier was so normal that the absence of tears was considered suspicious. The checkpoint has watched this era closely. The Romantic moment is the only era in the entire history of tears in which adult men in the West were not only allowed but expected to weep in public, often and visibly. The cargo, a bodily output that was now read as evidence of the depth of the soul, the refinement of the sensibility, the seriousness of the moral life, the job assigned, tears as moral display, tears as the visible signature of the cultivated interior. The cost of this era was that tears, for the first time in history, became aesthetically performed. Romantic weeping was sincere, but it was also stylized, learned from novels, rehearsed for company, and judged by audiences for its quality. The fifth job description for tears on the historical record was the body's signature of a noble interior. Era 6. The Victorian tear bottle. By the middle of the 19th century, an extraordinary object appeared in great numbers in middle-class British and American homes. A small, narrow, often hand-blown glass vial, sometimes silver-capped, sometimes corked with a piece of leather called a lacrimatory, or, in plainer English, a tear bottle. The widow held it to her cheek during the funeral and during mourning visits. Her tears, allowed to run down her face, were caught at the lip of the bottle. The bottle was sealed. The bottle was kept on the bedside table. When the tears inside the bottle had evaporated through the seal, the official period of mourning was said to be complete. The American Civil War era saw many of these bottles produced in domestic factories. Widows held the bottle through the funeral of a husband killed in battle. The evaporation cycle, which depended on the climate and the seal, often took several years. And the bottle, sitting on the bedside table, was understood to be measuring the survivor's mourning on the survivor's behalf. The checkpoint has held one of these bottles in inspection. They are smaller than a modern smartphone. They are heavier than they look. They hold less than a teaspoon of liquid. The cargo, a bodily output that was now considered substantial enough and rare enough to be preserved in a glass container as a keepsake of the dead. The job assigned, tears as commemorative substance. Tears as a measurable quantity of grief allowed to evaporate on its own schedule. The cost of this era was that grief became, for the first time, an object with a deadline. When the tears were gone from the bottle, the survivor was expected to be done. The sixth job description for tears on the historical record was the body's commemorative substance scheduled to expire. Era 7. The 20th century suppression. Something extraordinary happened between roughly 1900 and 1908 in most industrialized societies, especially among men, especially in the English-speaking world. The romantic weeping of the previous century was systematically taken out of the male body. Industrial era masculinity, 2 world wars, the trench and factory expectation of Stoicism, the rise of professional psychology with its early framing of crying as regression, and a flood of mid-century child-rearing books that told mothers to leave the infant boy to cry alone in the crib. All of these together produced one of the largest behavioral shifts in the recorded history of weeping. By 1970 in the United States, surveys showed that adult men cried, on average, less than once every 2 months. Adult women cried 5 to 10 times as often. The biological gland was identical. The cultural permission was not. The phrase boys don't cry, the phrase suck it up, the phrase get a grip, the phrase be a man. These are not eternal pieces of folk wisdom. They are mostly 20th century inventions. The checkpoint will tell you what the 20th century era did to the job description of tears. For the first time in the history of any major civilization, tears were not given a job. They were taken away from an entire demographic. The cargo, a bodily output that was now considered in roughly half of the modern population, evidence of weakness, immaturity, mental illness, or social failure. The job assigned in the female body a private indulgence to be hidden. In the male body, an output the host was instructed not to produce at all. The cost of this era was the first time in human history that a civilization actively engineered the suppression of an involuntary bodily signal in millions of people across generations. The seventh job description for tears on the historical record was the body's band output. Era 8. This is the era you are living in right now, the algorithmic era. Here is the real issue. Something extraordinary has happened in the last 15 years that the previous 7 eras of tears did not see coming. The 20th century suppression has in part been reversed, but the reversal has not handed weeping back to the body in the form the body had inherited from the previous 7 eras. The reversal has handed weeping to the platform, the crying selfie, the cry face filter, the phone propped on a bathroom mirror, recording a real tear in real time for an audience of strangers, with a caption explaining the cause. The checkpoint has been inspecting this era closely. Every previous era of tears in this video at least had a destination, a god, a funeral, a spouse, a novel's reader, a confessor, a glass bottle. Even the suppression era had a destination, the inside of the host, where the unshed tears were stored. This era has no destination. The destination is the feed, and the feed never closes. The notification at midnight, the post that performed well, the cry that landed for the algorithm, the cry that did not and was deleted by morning. The new genre of video in which a real person cries in real time, while the platform tracks watch through and comment volume on the weeping face. The cargo, a bodily output that combines the public ritual address of the Sumerian temple, the paid performance of the Roman prefeci, the theological signature of the Hebrew Psalms, the spiritual currency of the medieval mystic, the moral display of the romantic novel, the keepsake substance of the Victorian widow, the engineered suppression of the 20th century male body, and adds one new ingredient nothing in the previous 7 eras had: real-time scoring by a stranger through a screen while the tear is still on the host's face. The job assigned: tears as content, tears as engagement, tears as a small unit of value that the platform extracts from the host's lacrimal gland and sells by the impression to advertisers the host will never meet. The cost of this era is the most precise the checkpoint has ever named. It is the cost of running a 4,000-year-old bodily signal on inputs that are designed by software to never let it arrive without a camera in the room. This is why so many people in 2026 cannot quite tell when the tear finally arrives, whether it is a tear or a take. They are not unable to feel. They are running all 8 ages of tears at once in a body that was only ever built to run the first one. The 8th job description for tears on the historical record is the body's smallest unit of content, 8 ages of tears. The checkpoint has now inspected every one of them. Here is the pattern. Every era discovered the same 4,000-year-old lacrimal gland and assigned it a different official job. The Sumerian temple assigned it the job of temple voice. The Mediterranean Mourners Guild assigned it the job of paid labor. The Hebrew prophet assigned it the job of signed prayer. The medieval mystic assigned it the job of certificate of grace. The romantic novelist assigned it the job of signature of the noble soul. The Victorian widow assigned it the job of commemorative substance with a deadline. The 20th century industrial father assigned it the job of band output. The 2026 algorithm assigned it the job of content. The gland has never changed. The body's reasons for weeping have never changed. Only the assigned job has changed. The checkpoint will say it directly. Tears are the most assigned bodily output in the history of the human species. No other involuntary signal has been given as many contradictory job descriptions in as many civilizations in as short a span of time. The reason it feels so confusing in 2026 to know when, where, with whom, and for how long it is allowed to cry is not because the modern viewer is more emotional than their ancestors. It is because the modern viewer is the heir of 8 stacked contradictory job descriptions for the same gland, and the 8th one is being written in real time by a machine that pays for the writing in cents per impression. I lived for years inside the 7th job description, band output, and called it composure. It was not composure. It was an entire bodily vocabulary that had been taken out of me before I was old enough to ask why. The thing the room called strength was the absence of an organ the body had been issued at birth. The first time I cried as an adult, alone in a quiet room, with no one watching, no one listening, no phone in the room, no caption to write afterward. I noticed that the tear was not for any of the things I had thought I was carrying. It was for something much older. The body had been waiting to send that letter for years. The job descriptions had been opening the envelope before the body could finish writing it. The checkpoint has noticed something almost no neurologist and no anthropologist writes about clearly. The 8 ages of tears did not replace each other. They stacked. The Sumerian temple is still inside you. Every time the tear arrives in the middle of a prayer you did not intend to pray. The professional mourner is still inside you. Every time you have to weep on behalf of a family that cannot, in front of a casket, the others are too composed to face. The biblical era is still inside you. Every time the tear arrives during a sentence you were trying to say to whatever you consider larger than yourself. The medieval mystic is still inside you. Every time you secretly evaluate whether your tears were deep enough to count. The romantic novelist is still inside you. Every time you find yourself moved by a film or a song and a small part of the body notices with satisfaction that the tear has arrived. The Victorian widow is still inside you. Every time you wonder how long is too long to keep grieving the person who is gone. The 20th century industrial father is still inside you. Every time the tear nearly arrives in a meeting, a hallway, a car, an airport, and your face moves by reflex to make sure no one sees. The algorithm is still inside you. Every time the tear actually does arrive, and a quiet, small voice in the back of the room asks whether anyone would have watched it. That is why so many people in this generation cannot tell what their tears are anymore. They are not feeling one era's worth of permission. They are running all 8 eras of contradictory permission at once in a body that was only ever issued one gland. Here is the practice. It is small. The smallness is the point. The previous practices the checkpoint has given for emotional cargo have been written practices, breath practices, daily naming practices. This one is different. Tears live in the body. They must be permitted in the body. They cannot be analyzed into arriving, and they cannot be performed into arriving. The next time the tear nearly arrives, in a hallway, in a car, in a meeting, in the bath, in the middle of a sentence, do not perform it. Do not film it. Do not explain it. Do not delete it. If you are in public, find a private room, a bathroom, a car, a stairwell, a quiet corner. The checkpoint will tell you why this matters. The body was never built to weep under surveillance. Every era of human history, except the 8th one, understood this. The 7th era weaponized it. The 8th era erased it. Inside the private room, sit or stand or lean against the wall. Put the phone, if you are carrying one, on the floor, face down, out of reach. Then do nothing. Do not breathe in a special way. Do not say anything. Do not interpret the tear before the tear has arrived. The body knows how to weep. It has known for 4,000 years. It does not need instructions. It needs the absence of an audience. If the tear arrives, let it. If it does not, do not force it. The practice is not the tear. The practice is the room with no audience. The checkpoint has watched this single 5-minute practice unlock a grief that had been sealed in the host body for years, sometimes decades, sometimes the entire adult life of the person sitting in the room. Not because the room is magic, because the room is the first place in the host's modern life that has had no assigned job description for the tear. For the duration of that one room, the gland is not the temple voice. The gland is not the paid labor. The gland is not the certificate. The gland is not the noble display. The gland is not the keepsake. The gland is not the band output. The gland is not the content. The gland is just the gland. And the body is just the body. And the tear, if it arrives, is just the letter the body has been waiting to send. That is the practice. The checkpoint has noticed that the room with no audience is harder to find than at any point in the previous 4,000 years. The phone in the pocket is the 8th era's witness, and it is always in the room. Drift inward is the small, private page, the checkpoint built for exactly this kind of inspections, a place to name which era's job description ran your tears today, what the body was actually trying to release, and the smaller true sentence the tear would have arrived with if there had been no audience and no camera. It is not a fix. It is a single quiet page on a device whose other pages are designed to keep the 8th job description in front of every tear the host will ever shed. The ruling. Tears are the oldest involuntary vocabulary the human body has. You did not have to be taught to weep. You had to be taught not to. 8 civilizations have written 8 contradictory job descriptions on top of the same gland. And the 8th one is paid for in real time by a machine that needs your weeping to be visible. Find one room with no audience. Sit in it. Let the body remember which letter it has been trying to send. That is the only assignment that was ever actually yours.